Two private letters allegedly written to Donald Trump have suddenly become a major political story, and the timing could hardly be more revealing. The letters were reportedly written by Natalie Harp, one of the president's closest aides, and they contain intensely personal language about Trump, including statements describing him as the person who matters most to her, and repeated fears of disappointing him. But the letters are only one part of the story. Because at almost the exact moment this controversy exploded, Melania Trump stepped back into the public spotlight. And that raises a much bigger question. Why has this relationship become important enough that people inside and outside the White House are now asking who has access to the president, who influences what he sees, and what role the First Lady is playing in all of this? Tonight, we're separating what is documented from what is speculation. And by the end, the real issue may have very little to do with romance at all. The first thing to understand is what actually surfaced. Reports published this week describe two letters allegedly written by Natalie Harp to Donald Trump. CNN reported that the letters were published in full by the Daily Beast and were said to have been written in 2023. But CNN also made an important qualification. The network had not independently confirmed that Harp wrote or sent the letters. That distinction matters, because the internet can turn an allegation into a fact within minutes. We are not going to do that here. What we do know is that the letters reportedly contain extraordinarily personal language for communications between a presidential aide and the president she works for. One reported passage describes Trump as the person who matters most to Harp. Another expresses a strong desire not to disappoint him, and another reportedly describes Harp as feeling unworthy of Trump. Those words immediately changed the conversation around her. Until now, much of the attention surrounding Natalie Harp had focused on her unusual position inside Trump's orbit. She became known as the president's human printer because she reportedly carried a portable printer and supplied Trump with material he wanted to see. That might sound like a strange but harmless staff habit, but there is a bigger question underneath it. If one aide is constantly deciding what information reaches the president, what gets printed, what gets highlighted, what gets placed directly in front of him, then that person occupies an unusual position of influence. And that is where this story becomes political. Because Donald Trump is not simply a private businessman receiving messages from an employee. He is the President of the United States. And the people closest to a president inevitably become part of the national security conversation. That is why these letters have attracted so much attention, not simply because of how personal they allegedly sound, but because they offer another window into a relationship that was already attracting questions. And that brings us to Natalie Harp herself. Natalie Harp is not a random figure who suddenly appeared inside the White House. Her connection to Trump goes back years. She became a prominent Trump supporter after publicly discussing her own medical history and crediting Trump's right-to-try policy with helping her access experimental treatment. She later worked in conservative media and became increasingly connected to Trump's political operation. Eventually, she joined his orbit directly. And one of the strangest descriptions attached to her was that human printer nickname. According to reporting, Harp would print articles, social media material, and other information for Trump, who has often preferred physical material to navigating large amounts of information on his phone. That role sounds mundane, but in a political operation, information flow is power. Imagine the difference between a president seeing 10 stories and seeing only 3. Imagine the difference between reading criticism and reading praise. Imagine the difference between receiving raw information and receiving information that has already been selected, printed, and placed directly in front of you. That does not automatically mean wrongdoing. It does, however, explain why staff access matters. And according to reporting, Harp's role eventually went beyond simply printing material. She was also reportedly involved in Trump's Truth Social operation and became a highly visible presence around him. That level of proximity made her different from an ordinary political aide. And then came the stories about the letters. Michael Wolff, who has written extensively about Trump, had previously discussed personal notes allegedly left by Harp for Trump. But until recently, the public had not seen the reported contents in the same detail. Now, portions of those letters have been published, And suddenly, the old questions about access, loyalty, and influence have returned. Only this time, they are much harder to ignore. This is where the story gets more complicated. The most important detail isn't simply that Harp allegedly wrote Trump letters. It is the tone of those letters. According to reporting, the messages included repeated apologies, intense praise, and statements emphasizing how important Trump was to her. One reported letter was connected to a situation during a trip involving Scotland. Harp reportedly apologized for panicking during a transportation problem and for potentially embarrassing Trump while walking on a golf course. On the surface, that might sound like an employee apologizing to a boss, but the language reportedly went much further. The letters allegedly contained deeply emotional statements about Trump and repeated concerns about disappointing him. And that distinction is what has driven the reaction. An ordinary workplace apology is one thing. A highly emotional, personal letter to the president is something else. But there is another important point. There is no evidence from these letters alone that a romantic relationship existed between Harp and Trump. That has not been established, and responsible reporting should not pretend otherwise. The real question is different. Why was this relationship reportedly so unusually intense? And why did it matter to people around the president? That question becomes even more significant because previous reporting had already described concerns about Harp's closeness to Trump. Some accounts have claimed that people around Trump, including members of the Secret Service, had concerns about the intensity of the relationship. Again, those reports should be treated as reports, not proven facts. But they point toward the same underlying issue: access. Who gets close to the president? Who can interrupt him? Who can influence what information reaches him? Who can communicate with him when others cannot? Those questions matter in every presidency, and they matter even more when the person involved is reportedly controlling part of the information environment surrounding the president. That is why the letters have become more than a bizarre Washington story. They are now being examined as part of a much larger picture, and that picture brings Melania Trump back into the center of the story. For weeks, Melania Trump had attracted attention because of her relatively limited public presence. Then, as the Natalie Harp controversy intensified, the First Lady appeared publicly. At an event connected to her Fostering the Future initiative, Melania addressed the audience with a line that immediately attracted attention. She essentially acknowledged that people had noticed her absence and told them she was there. It was not a public confrontation with Trump. It was not an angry statement about Natalie Harp. And there is no verified public evidence that Melania lost it over the letters. But the timing was striking, because the public was already asking questions about the unusual closeness between Trump and Harp. And now Melania was suddenly back in front of the cameras. That naturally created speculation. Was the appearance planned? Was it simply part of her normal schedule? Was she deliberately reminding people that she was still active? We cannot know her private motivation unless she says so, and that distinction is crucial. But politically, the optics were powerful. Melania appeared publicly alongside the president at a moment when the conversation surrounding his inner circle was becoming increasingly personal. And she did something she has often done throughout Trump's political career. She communicated without saying very much. That has become part of her public style. She does not routinely respond to every controversy. She does not hold daily political briefings, and she rarely explains her private relationship with Donald Trump to the public. So when she appears, people pay attention. And this time, her appearance arrived amid a controversy that was already asking questions about who occupies the space closest to the president. But there is another reason the Melania angle matters. It takes us away from celebrity gossip and toward a serious political question. What happens when a president's personal relationships overlap with the machinery of government? This is arguably the most important part of the entire story. Forget the internet speculation for a moment. Forget whether people think the letters sound romantic, strange, or inappropriate. The serious question is access. CNN reported that concerns have been raised about Harp's access to Trump and about her security clearance. That is a completely different category of issue. Presidential aides can potentially encounter sensitive information simply because of where they work and who they work for. The closer someone is to the president, the more carefully their access has to be evaluated. That does not mean every person around Trump automatically has access to classified information. It means the system is supposed to determine who is cleared, who is authorized, and what information they can handle. And according to reporting, questions emerged over how long Harp was around Trump without a security clearance. That is the part of this story that deserves more attention than the sensational headlines. Because a president's inner circle is not just a social circle. It is part of the national security environment. The president speaks with foreign leaders. He receives intelligence briefings. He discusses military operations. He makes decisions that can affect markets, wars, and international alliances. So when an aide has extraordinary proximity to the president, the basic question becomes, has the access been properly controlled? That is a legitimate question regardless of political party. And this is exactly why the Harp story has become much bigger than the letters themselves. The letters may reveal something about the intensity of the relationship, but the security questions reveal why that intensity could matter. And now we reach the most important turning point. Because the controversy isn't simply about Natalie Harp. It is also about how the Trump White House responded when the story began exploding. The White House response created another problem. When political scandals begin developing, administrations have a basic choice: ignore them, address them, or attack the people asking questions. The Trump administration has frequently chosen an aggressive response when stories threaten the president, and the Natalie Harp controversy was no exception. The administration pushed back strongly against criticism surrounding Harp, but that response may have had an unintended consequence. Instead of ending the conversation, it helped keep the story alive. Because once the White House begins publicly defending a relatively obscure aide, reporters naturally start asking, why is this person important enough to defend? What exactly is her role? How much access does she have? Who hired her? What does she do for the president? And who else inside the administration is concerned about her influence? That is how a personnel story becomes a political story. And then there is another layer. Senator Jon Ossoff publicly criticized Trump in connection with Harp, triggering an unusually intense political reaction. That led to a broader debate about whether criticism of Harp was sexist or whether it was really about her professional role and access to the president. That distinction matters. You can criticize a government employee's influence without making assumptions about her personal life. You can ask questions about security clearance without claiming a romantic relationship. And you can question presidential access without turning the story into gossip. In fact, that is exactly where the strongest journalism should focus. Because if the problem is simply that a political aide writes strange personal letters, that is mostly a workplace and personal matter. But if the same aide has unusual access to the president, influences what information he sees, participates in his communications, and potentially encounters sensitive information, the stakes become much higher. And that is the line this story has crossed. So what should viewers actually watch now? First, watch for more reporting about Natalie Harp's official role. The more we understand exactly what she does for the president, the easier it becomes to evaluate whether the controversy is primarily personal or institutional. Second, watch the security clearance issue. That may ultimately be more consequential than the letters. If legitimate questions remain about access to the president or sensitive information, those questions deserve clear answers from the administration. Third, watch Melania. Not because we should assume she is secretly furious. We shouldn't. There is no verified public evidence that she had a dramatic confrontation with Trump over these letters. But her public appearances will continue to attract attention because of the timing. And if she chooses to address the issue directly, that would obviously change the story. Until then, the safest conclusion is that Melania has re-entered the public conversation at precisely the moment when questions about Trump's inner circle are intensifying. And finally, watch how the White House handles the controversy going forward, because political damage is often created not by the original story, but by the response to it. If the administration provides clear answers about Harp's role, access, and clearance, the story may gradually lose momentum. If questions remain unanswered, every new report will create another layer. And that is why the letters matter. Not because they prove some secret romance. They don't. Not because they prove Melania had a meltdown. They don't. They matter because they provide another piece of evidence about the unusual ecosystem surrounding the president. An ecosystem built around loyalty, access, information, and personal trust. And those things become extraordinarily important when the person at the center of them is the President of the United States. At the beginning, we asked a simple question. Why did these letters suddenly become such a major story? Now we have a clearer answer. The letters themselves are unusual, but the larger issue is what they reveal about the environment around Donald Trump. Natalie Harp has reportedly occupied an unusually close position in Trump's world. Reports have described her as a constant presence, an information filter, and a highly loyal aide. Now, alleged private letters have given the public a much more personal look at that relationship. At the same time, Melania Trump has reappeared publicly, creating a striking political contrast. But we should be careful not to fill the gaps with assumptions. We don't know what Melania privately thinks. We don't know whether she confronted Trump. We don't know whether there is any romantic relationship between Trump and Harp. And we should not turn speculation into fact. What we do know is that questions about presidential access are real. Questions about security clearance are real. And questions about who controls the flow of information around a president are legitimate questions in any administration. That is ultimately what makes this story worth watching. Because the most consequential political stories are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they begin with something as small as a letter. And then the questions get bigger. Who wrote it? Why was it written? Who knew about it? Who had access? And most importantly, what does that relationship mean for the way information reaches the president? Those are the questions that deserve answers. And if new documents, official statements, or credible reporting emerge, they could tell us much more about what has really been happening inside Trump's inner circle. For now, the letters are a window. The security questions are the bigger story. And Melania's return to the spotlight may be only the beginning of the next chapter. If you want to follow where this story goes next, keep an eye on the people closest to the president, because sometimes the most important developments happen far away from the podium. And if you have a view on whether the real issue here is the letters, presidential access, or the security questions, let us know in the comments.